So speaking first will be Dr. Shobhana Xavier, who is Assistant Professor of Religion and Diaspora in the School of Religion at Queen's University in Canada. She is the author of one book, co-author of another book. She's the sole author of Sacred Spaces and Transnational Networks, Bawa Mohayedin and Contemporary Shrine Cultures, that came out in 2018. And she is the co-author of Contemporary Sufism, Piety, Politics, and Popular Culture, that was published in 2017. She thinks and writes on contemporary Sufism, including in Sri Lanka. And she'll be talking, I think, about that to us today. Her paper is titled Public as Space, The Possibilities and Contestations of Sufi Shrines in Sri Lanka. And so with that, I turn over the floor to our three panelists, beginning with Dr. Shobhana Xavier.
I'm just gonna share my screen. Great. Folks can see it, so thumbs up. Yeah, great, okay. Thank you so much, Audrey, for the introduction, and thank you, Rohit, for organizing such a wonderful two-day conference. And it's a pleasure to be in community with folks, even if it's virtually. Been enjoying hearing your, at least the first panel. It was great. So I'm presenting some work that's in progress and something that I've been thinking about in terms of field work since 2011. I come and go to this space partly because Sri Lanka is a challenging space to navigate fieldwork in, so it's often difficult to maintain sustained fieldwork in a space, especially around politicized spaces. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and probably you'll get a sense of why some of the fieldwork that I do here is challenging. Most of my work is invested in or interested in thinking about contemporary Sufism, and so I've thought a lot about it in the North American context and continue to do so. And the Sri Lankan context kind of emerged as a byproduct of my engagement in the North American context, partly because there's a Tamil Sufi teacher that's buried in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, whose origins is in northern Sri Lanka and Jaffna. And so that's the story that essentially led me to thinking about Sri Lanka broadly, which then resulted in this particular project. And so what I've been doing is thinking a lot about the way in which Sufi shrines exist in the contemporary moment. And I'm amongst South Asianists, so many of you are quite know about maybe the Sri Lankan context, but I'll just say a little bit in terms of why I think Sufi shrines are kind of situated in a unique situation in the context of Sri Lanka. Like most nation state projects, Sri Lanka obviously went through the process of independence from Britain, but I think what has informed or been challenging in the project of nation building has been these fault lines around linguistic identities that have gone on to define ethnic identities. At times, religion has accented or amplified these fault lines. And so a lot of this is really embedded around language. So if you speak Sinhala or if you speak Tamil, and then also in terms of oddly, for Muslim communities, religiosity, so being Muslim is itself an ethnic identity. So there's a lot of majority-minority politics that has informed the Sri Lankan context, which eventually led to, in the 1980s, to a civil war that only ended in 2009. So this has been quite recent. The civil war was between kind of a Tamil rebel militant organization, the Tamil Tigers, and also the nation state, which kind of has embodied this kind of Sinhala Buddhist identity, which I could speak a lot more about in the Q&A. So this is kind of the context. So even though the war ended and it's kind of assumed that the separatist cause of the Tamil people, which was essentially meant to kind of seek sovereignty, ended, what is meant post 2009 is that there's a new scapegoat, right? There's a new idea of a minority in which to construct the nation state against, and part of that new community has essentially been Muslims, right? Muslim here both as an ethnic identity, but also religious identity. So there's been instances since 2009 that's resulted in kind of showcasing the precarity of Muslim communities. And this has often been positioned of extremist Buddhist communities that have been targeting Muslim communities, particularly through spaces, but also sometimes through businesses and homes. And so there's been a series of communal violence that have emerged, unfortunately has been the historical reality of of Sri Lanka. And we see these in instances, right? So recently during COVID, for instance, there was a mandate from the Sri Lankan government to cremate everybody who died of COVID. And this was obviously challenging, particularly to Muslim communities who do not practice cremation. So there was kind of an international outcry, and a lot of the resistance and international support came from some Arab Gulf countries who are trying to push against this, and this was only rescinded in last year around this time, right? The incident that I think has also challenged a lot of this is also the Easter bombings that took place in 2019, which were tied to individuals, Muslims who affirmed ties to ISIS, which further kind of created this idea that Muslims are a group that we need to pay attention to. They are, the typical Islamophobic stereotypes that so many people are accustomed to in the West, which is embedded within a growing Buddhist nationalism. So this is kind of the political context in which I'm thinking about some of these Sufi shrine spaces. And so I'm thinking about Sufi shrines in Sri Lanka, partly because of this context, but also because I'm interested in thinking about issues of mobility, movement, networks across the Indian Ocean. So for instance, to the west in the Arab Gulf, and to the east to the Malay world and the Southeast Asian world, right? And there's been a lot of amazing literature that's been written about it and historicizing the networks here. And so because my investment has been in sacred spaces, I've been drawn more and more to sacred spaces, particularly Sufi shrines in Sri Lanka, because I find them embedded in a very precarious context that is based on territorial rights, rights to nationalism, but also these other possibilities, right? Access to women, ritual and ethnic pluralism in a context of kind of a space in which communal violence is quite common. So I'll signal to some of this. Obviously, I won't be able to engage all of them fully, but hopefully this will give a sense of the broader conversation that this panel is hoping to have. And I'm happy to come back to some of this in the Q&A. So in the context of Sri Lanka, when I'm thinking about Sufi spaces, I often start with Adam's Peak, partly because this is the space that has been of interest to many folks across Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, and Christian communities. Adam's Peak, or Sripada, is conceived today, or is constructed today, as a predominantly Buddhist space. But we know historically from a lot of writings, from Arab writers, from South Asian Muslim writers, that Adam's Peak also had a particular connotation, specifically cosmologically for Muslims. We see that Ibn Battuta, for instance, traveled to Ceylon or Serendip just to make the pilgrimage. And in his travel logs, he writes about encountering dervishes along the way as much as yogis, right? In different shrines. And so because of this allure of Adam's Peak, essentially that the prophet Adam was expelled from paradise, and in the process of expulsion landed in Sri Lanka or Serendip or in the Indian Ocean, right? There's different kind of mappings of this, and his partner Eve was displaced to Jeddah, and they eventually reunited and started humanity here, right? So there's this narrative that becomes very significant for Muslims, which over time has kind of been purged or silenced, right? There's less and less presence of this narrative even today. This is a huge tourist attraction, and it's predominantly walked by Buddhists today. But why Adam's Peak is important is that I think that it then becomes a base in which a Sufi pilgrimage network gets constructed, where there's other spaces, right? So another famous one is Dr. Jelani, and then Kataragama. So I kind of conceive of these as the major ones. Dr. Jelani is attributed to Abdul Qadir Jelani, who was a 12th century Baghdadi theologian and Sufi. And there's this kind of narrative in South India, but also in Sri Lanka, that there's this period of 11 years where he kind of goes away or is accounted for. And there's a sense that he kind of traveled. And one of the places he essentially traveled to was, maybe South India, but also in Sri Lanka, where then a hermitage site or kind of a jungle-based Sufi shrine was constructed for him. And there's lots of mythologies, and subsequent Sufis or individuals have been entombed in this open air kind of shrine space. What this means, though, is that these Sufi spaces sometimes end up being constructed or claimed by other folks, right? And in the context of Sri Lanka, Dr. Jelani, for instance, which Sufis hold is this important site associated with Abdul Jelani, is also a Buddhist hermitage site, or they understand as Karagala. And so these kind of moments of tension highlight how kind of issues of ownership, territorial rights come up. And this one space, Dr. Jelani, has been written about quite a bit, and a lot of folks have highlighted how it has gone back and forth using kind of archaeological work to prove who owns the space, who is legitimately are the inheritors of the space, with government supporting particular Buddhist monks' claims that these are Buddhist sites and a Buddhist hermitage site before it was a Sufi or a Muslim site, right? And so this then kind of informs what happens in around these sites. So just recently, for instance, there's been kind of instances of taking away Sufi, just buildings that are on the site that are either Muslim shops or a shrine. There was a cave to kind of hither the perennial mystic that Sufis understand as this mystical figure that was taken away. And just recently they're building on top of one of the spaces to hopefully claim it as, you know, this is a Buddhist hermitage site, and it's been supported by the government to do so. So these kind of narratives tend to be common across communities, but I think I'm noticing more and more that has a particular logic or rhetoric in the contemporary moment in post-war, partly because there's a growing anti-Muslim sentiment, right? And that's being translated into kind of targeting particular Muslim spaces that are seen legibly as Muslim by non-Muslims, in this case, individuals with particular understandings of Buddhism. The aspect that's challenging about this, and this is a point that I'll end off on, is that as some spaces are being targeted because they're Muslim spaces and it's being targeted for a particular agenda, making or constructing Sri Lanka as a Buddhist nation, within the context or amongst Muslims themselves, there's different sentiments about where Sufism is and if Sufism itself is legitimate. So I think there's a particular emergence of anti-Sufi rhetoric that also plays into this, which then results in perhaps not the same attention that's given to particular Sufi spaces when they are targeted, because some Muslims may feel that they are not legitimately Islamic spaces anyway, they're potentially heretical, so they should be kind of gotten rid of. They're a relic of an old era, right? And one of the really, really unique spaces that I've encountered during my field work are these shrines that are long, 40-feet shrines. And these shrines are housed in kind of coastal regions around Sri Lanka, in the east, in the south. And there's this, tradition that essentially these spaces are dedicated to figures who are descendants of the prophet, because historically there's some understandings or hagiographies that relay that the prophetic figures were giants. Right. And so individuals historically were giants, and humanity regressed because they were morally or ethically not strong human beings anymore, and they shrunk in size. And so because of this, the idea of these long shrines, they're not Padimola, it's just essentially 40-feet long shrines that are dedicated to saintly figures, are kind of found everywhere. But what you'll find is when you go to these spaces are often kind of not taken care of and kind of shut. Actually, most of them are shut down. And so in this picture, you'll see that when you do go to the shrine, you're supposed to call the phone numbers that are on the board, and the local community is supposed to come and open it up. But most of these places do end up being shut down. And when you do call, the numbers are out of service, saying that these are spaces that some Muslim communities in localized regions, Muslim councils don't want you visiting because they see them potentially as heretical sites. Despite this, people still go, Muslims, non-Muslims, women particularly, go to these spaces and access them, light incense, and do venerate at these sites, right? So essentially, I'm kind of interested in thinking about Sufi shrines as wedged between a particular Buddhist nationalism, but also thinking about how they're being perceived or not supported by other Muslims who are espousing more and more anti-Sufi sentiments. So I will leave it at that. I think that's about 10 minutes. But yeah. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. I found that really interesting. And I think it's very useful to be so grounded in this sort of physical space.